Ever split the cost of takeout with a friend and wondered, did I just pay for their extra guac?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Today's deep dive takes that relatable feeling to a whole new level, believe me. We're tackling a Canadian legal case
Oh, this is a good one.
about a couple, Mrs. Bell and Mr. Bailey, who lived together for years. They weren't married,
Right.
but separating. Turns out it wasn't as simple as just moving out.
Yeah, this case is like a crash course in why what's mine is yours. Can get complicated really fast.
Yeah.
We're digging into the idea of
Yeah.
unjust enrichment
Okay.
when one person in a relationship kind of walks away with a bigger slice of the financial pie than they deserve,
Yeah.
based on what they put in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our sources are excerpts from the actual Ontario Court of Appeal judgment in the case of Curry v. Bailey from way back in 2001.
Hmm.
No secondhand interpretations here. We're going straight to the legal source.
That's right.
So, to set the scene, Mrs. Bell and Mr. Bailey's story begins back in 1989.
Think shoulder pads, cassette tapes. It was a different time. Big hair?
Yeah, big hair. Mrs. Bell moves in with Mr. Bailey,
Right.
and right away, their financial situations are very different.
Okay.
She's coming in with minimal assets.
Okay.
He owns his home
Hmm.
and already has money in RISPs.
Okay.
Like, those Canadian retirement savings plans.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But, and this feels important, Miss Bell starts contributing financially to their shared life from day one.
Yes, absolutely.
We're not just talking about her share of the groceries here, are
Oh,
we?
no, this is more significant.
Yeah.
Right. Initially, she's chipping in around $450 a month,
Right.
which is what she was paying her parents for rent and utilities.
Hmm.
And this is on top of
Wow.
receiving spousal support from a previous relationship.
Okay, so she's pulling her weight even in those early years. Was there a specific point where the court felt things became unbalanced?
Yeah, so the court really honed in on the period from 1989 to roughly 1993.
Okay.
See, Mr. Bailey was dealing with a leftover financial hurdle.
A $40,000 lump sum he owed to his ex-wife.
Ooh, okay.
To tackle this debt quickly,
Yeah,
he took out a mortgage on his house
okay.
and was making these accelerated payments.
So he's starting this new relationship with some serious financial baggage.
You could say that, yes. And the court really zeroed in on the fact that Mr. Bell wasn't just covering her half of their day-to-day expenses.
Right.
She was going above and beyond,
Yeah.
directly contributing $6,000
Wow.
towards those extra mortgage payments.
Okay.
They saw this as a clear sign of her commitment to helping Mr. Bailey get out of this financial hole
Right.
that predated their relationship.
Okay, so let me get this straight. She's helping him build a solid financial future while also trying to, create her own life. It's setting up a classic unjust enrichment scenario, right?
Exactly. This wasn't just about, them splitting the cost of living.
Right.
Her contributions were directly impacting Mr. Bailey's long-term financial well-being.
Right.
And that becomes super important later on.
Yeah.
This period lays the groundwork for the court's eventual decision.
Okay. So Mrs. Bell is being incredibly supportive, financially speaking, during those, crucial early years.
Right.
But relationships, they're rarely static, are they? Did things stay that way?
This is where the case takes an interesting turn.
Okay.
Around 1994,
Mhm.
a few years into their cohabitation,
Yeah.
the dynamic kind of starts to shift.
Okay.
The judgment hints that their relationship wasn't quite as harmonious as before.
Right.
And on the financial front, we see some key changes.
Hit us with a plot twist. What changes?
First off, Mr. Bailey managed to pay off that looming debt
Okay.
from his previous marriage.
Right.
This is a big deal.
Yeah.
Because it frees up his finances considerably.
Right.
He's no longer playing catch up. And we start to see him acquire new assets.
Okay.
A truck.
Okay.
And get this, even a boat.
Okay, so he's leveling up.
Yes.
Financially speaking.
Yeah.
What about Mrs. Bell?
She starts contributing to her own RRSP. Remember, at this time, RSPs were really becoming popular as retirement savings tools in Canada.
Right. Right.
So she's taking steps to secure her own financial future.
It sounds like both of them are becoming more financially independent during this period.
You've got it.
Yeah.
The court actually found that from roughly 1994 to their separation in 1997, their financial contributions evened out, significantly.
Yeah.
Remember how Mrs. Bell was contributing more proportionally in those early years?
Right.
That wasn't the case anymore.
It's almost like you can draw a line in the sand, right?
Yeah.
The first period where Mrs. Bell is contributing more to help Mr. Bailey stabilize, and then the second phase where things are more balanced, even though their relationship itself might be on shakier ground.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this distinction between the two periods becomes absolutely crucial to how the court ultimately ruled.
Okay, so let's talk court decisions.
Okay.
Did they find that Mr. Bailey was unjustly enriched?
They did, but with a catch. The court found that Mr. Bailey was unjustly enriched only during that first period,
Okay.
from 1989 to 1993.
So only during the time when Miss Bell was, like, disproportionately contributing
Exactly.
to their shared life and to Mr. Bailey becoming financially secure?
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
They emphasized that in those early years, Mrs. Bell's contributions were like above and beyond what would typically be expected in, a relationship like this,
Right.
especially given, Mr. Bailey's financial obligations from his previous marriage.
It almost seems like the court was acknowledging that, like, while they were building a life together, she was also helping him rebuild his financial foundation.
Right.
Yeah.
And the court felt she didn't receive a fair benefit in return,
Right.
considering her level of contribution during that, specific time frame.
Yeah.
But they also acknowledged that the situation changed significantly after Mr. Bailey paid off his debt,
Okay.
and their contributions became more balanced.
So how does the court even begin to untangle this? How do you put a price on fairness, like, years after the fact?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
The court had to figure out how to compensate Ms. Bell for that period of unjust enrichment.
Right.
They considered something called a constructive trust.
Okay, I've definitely heard that term thrown around, but I'll admit I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Yeah.
Aha.
Essentially, imagine a constructive trust as a legal tool that says,
Okay.
even though on paper this asset belongs to one person,
Yeah.
because of the circumstances, someone else deserves a share of it.
So in this case, were they considering saying that Mr. Bailey's house, which, like, presumably had increased in value during their time together,
Yeah.
should be partly owned by Mrs. Bell?
That was on the table.
Yeah.
And it happens in some cases,
Right.
but in this instance, the court decided to go a different route.
Okay.
They opted for a monetary award instead, meaning they ordered Mr. Bailey to pay Mrs. Bell a specific sum of money.
Fascinating. Why did they choose a cash payout over, say, giving Mrs. Bell a portion of the house's value?
This is where we dive into some legal weeds, but I promise it's worth it.
Okay.
The judgment talks about these concepts of value received
Okay.
versus value survived.
Okay.
It all comes down to how we measure what Mrs. Bell should receive.
Okay, break it down for me.
Okay.
Value received versus value survived. What's the difference?
Value received looks at the direct benefit Mr. Bailey enjoyed,
Yeah.
thanks to Mrs. Bell's contributions.
Right.
Imagine it like this. How did her efforts, both financial and otherwise, concretely improve his situation during that period of unjust enrichment?
Okay, so it's about putting a price tag on what Mrs. Bell put in,
Yeah.
essentially.
So
What about value survived?
Value survived focuses more on how much a particular asset, like the house,
Right.
increased in value,
Yeah.
and how much of that increase you could directly link back to Mrs. Bell's contributions.
Yeah. Interesting. So it's less about what Mrs. Bell personally contributed and more about how much her contributions boosted the value of specific things over time.
You've got it.
Okay.
In this case, the court considered both approaches,
Right.
but ultimately they based the monetary award on the value received.
So they focused on what her contributions directly did for Mr. Bailey,
Exactly.
rather than getting bogged down in tracing their exact impact on, say, his house's value over a span of years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another fascinating later of this case. The court's decision to adjust the initial award they calculated.
Okay.
It really raises questions about how we value those less tangible contributions,
Right.
especially in these kinds of relationships.
Okay, so they've chosen their approach. Value received is
Yeah.
what happens next. How did the court arrive at a dollar amount? Did Miss Bell get, like, a cashier's check for being an awesome partner?
Not quite.
Okay.
The court tallied things up
Okay.
and initially landed on $46,300
Okay.
to compensate Mrs. Bell. That figure considered the increase in value of both Mr. Bailey's house and his RRSPs during their time together.
Right.
But, and this is where the case gets especially thought-provoking,
Okay.
they decided they decided to adjust this initial amount.
This is what you were hinting at earlier, right? There's more to this than like a simple calculation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The court emphasized that they were only looking at that first period
Right.
from 89 to 93
Right.
when determining unjust enrichment.
Right. Right.
Remember? That's when Mrs. Bell was shouldering a larger share of the financial burden.
Yeah.
The second period where things were more balanced wasn't part of this particular equation.
Which makes sense given everything we've learned about how the court like divided their relationship into these two distinct phases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they took a closer look at what Mrs. Bell contributed during those early years.
Okay.
Her financial help with the mortgage, her role in managing the household,
Mm-hmm.
all while Mr. Bailey was still tackling those, pre-existing debts.
Right.
They acknowledged that while she did manage to build up some assets during their time together,
Right.
that didn't erase the fact that she'd also helped Mr. Bailey, significantly improve his financial standing.
So it's like the court was saying, we see that she was building her own future, but she was also instrumental in helping him secure his.
Yes.
And that deserves to be recognized.
A great way to put it.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they reduced the award to $15,000
Mm-hmm.
as a more accurate reflection
Okay.
in their view of the value received by Mr. Bailey during that specific window of unjust enrichment.
This case really underscores how complicated it can be to untangle finances after like a long-term relationship, even when you haven't, signed a marriage certificate.
It really is.
It's a good reminder that what's mine is yours gets messy, like really fast.
It definitely highlights that the law doesn't always have easy black and white answers,
Right.
especially when it comes to relationships.
Right.
This wasn't about, punishing Mr. Bailey,
Yeah.
but rather about trying to find a fair outcome
Right.
given the circumstances.
This whole deep dive has me thinking, how might this have played out differently if Miss Bazell and Mr. Bailey had like a written agreement
Right.
outlining their financial contributions and expectations from the get-go?
It's a question we should all consider.
Yeah.
Regardless of our relationship status,
Yeah.
Curry v. Bailey isn't just a fascinating legal case.
Right.
It's a reminder that open communication and, dare I say, a bit of paperwork
Yeah.
can save a lot of heartache and uncertainty down the road.
Because as we've learned today, love and finances can be a complex mix.
They really can.
Sometimes a little preemptive planning can go a long way.
Absolutely.
Big thanks to you for unpacking this case with us.
My pleasure. It's always great to be here.
And for all you listeners, keep those takeout receipts handy. You never know when you might need to calculate value received for that extra guacamole. Until next time, happy deep diving.